Here's my mechanism plate. Here's the blade actuating ring. That's all been cleaned. The retainer plate only fits in one spot. It's got a little locating rivet on it, so you can't really make many mistakes there. 3 short screws and 1 long screw. You'll have taken note of where the long screw fitted when you took it apart. As an aid to memory, you can always scratch a little mark on that part of the shutter so you know where the long screw went. It's not uncommon to find marks like that in shutters. If there's 1 short screw and 3 long screws, you might find a tiny S marking the spot where the short screw will go. Or if there's 1 long screw and 3 shorts, you might find a letter L scratched in where the long screw goes. When you've done lots and lots of them, you don't need to make marks because you remember from last time and the time before. Right, all the screws are present. I'll tighten them up. Check that moves freely. That's good. The lever on the top of the shutter that works the blade actuating ring is this one. Normally I just give the pivot point and the slot where it drives the pin on the blade actuating ring a white with molybdenum paste. It needs very little. Enough to make a dirty mark is plenty. Do that screw up. Check that moves freely. That's good. Fit the return spring. Check that that's snappy in its action. That all feels very good. The retard gear train here, I've flushed that with Naphtha. That's running smoothly. And this I'm going to lubricate lightly with some graphite powder before I reassemble everything else. Alright, I ran out. I had to buy some more graphite powder. I'm pretty sure this is only about the 3rd time in my life I've bought graphite powder, maybe the 4th. This one will see me out, no worries. I'll put a bit of graphite powder into the retard gear train and work that repeatedly. I'll put a bit of graphite powder into the blade actuating ring here and work that repeatedly, tipping this backwards and forwards so that it settles in. I just want all the contact surfaces in there to get a little bit of graphite on it. That's enough. I'll just go and blow this out, then can assemble the shutter blades. Right, shutter clean, mechanism plate clean, graphite powder applied. The shutter blades can be put on there, if I can find them. Blade number 1 is distinguished by having an extra hole in it. Let's just prepare this. Here, that spring's unhooked, that's swung out, that's good. And blade number 1 goes right here. blade number 2. Blade number 3. These blades had a few dirty marks on them, but they weren't particularly oily. They didn't require much in the way of cleaning. Just the usual naphtha. They certainly didn't need to be polished. Right, that's our blades in position on the mechanism plate. I'm going to put the case on the top now. It's easy to line up. You can see the square hole in there and the square hole here. Bring this over to the edge of the table so that this thing doesn't catch on things. Swing that down into place. Be careful, because if you bump it, you may end up knocking one of the blades out of position. With 3 case screws, just run those lightly down. Don't do them up tight at this stage. The blades become displaced while you're putting the case on. You could damage it if you just tighten the screws up. It's not something that happens very frequently, but it does happen. Okay, there you are. Blades open and shut. I'll put the return spring in place. That's all working. That's all nice and snappy. I'll tighten up these 3 case screws. That's the blades in. Now I can start reassembling other components. Normally I start with the flash contact. I'll just check and see if I can get that little black plastic insulator, if I can recover that. They're often quite distorted and don't want to come back out of the little hole that they were fitted through. Just using the tip of the tweezers here to poke that through. Right, it's fallen out. It's here somewhere. Okay, so I'll put my contact down. Here it is. That tiny little black dot, that's our insulator. I'll put that over here, out of harm's way. Flash contact goes in here, down that square hole in the mechanism plate. The plastic contact block here is made from some styrene like plastic. It's fragile, it's aged, almost certainly it's fragmenting. This one is. Difficult to get it to go down the hole because it's no longer as square as it used to be. It started. I'm going to loosen up the case screws. Give me a bit more wiggle room. I don't think it's down that far yet, but it'll give me just a little bit more wiggle room to get that thing lined up where it passes through the case. I don't think it's hanging up on the mechanism plate by the feel of it, not the case. it might be getting hung up on that brass plate. There you are, it just dropped down into position. So a single screw holds that in place. The existence of that plastic flash contact block is why you should never flush clean a shutter of this sort, because any solvent on that just melts that plastic. It's very sensitive to solvent and turns it to a gooey mess. So occasionally you see them shutters come here and this is just a amorphous blob because someone squirted solvent into the shutter to clean it. It's not a winning method. Alright, the 500th of a second speed spring, the high speed spring, that can drop in here. Our pallet can go in here. The lever that drives the pallets can go in next. Now this needs some lubrication right on that point, both faces of that point. Now that's a catch, that's where it holds things shut. Help if I put it in the right place. Where's our pallet wheel? There's our pallet wheel. This is what I'm looking for, is the wheel that drives the pallet wheel. It's got a little cam on the top. That cam closes our shutter blades, our flash contact. That's better. Now, put this in place. Put our flash contact in here. Before you screw that down, make sure that the arm here is not sitting on top of the toe of the cam. Otherwise you'll just end up bending things. And check, see if that cam moves freely. Appears to. I'm just getting the timing of that right, so that when this thing is latched behind this catch here, this arm can move freely past the long side of that cam. That appears to be the case, so that looks good. Now I can hook the spring in place for that lever. This pair of tweezers might do it for me. Yep. Now that lever's just come apart on me. This is a two-piece arrangement and it's held together by next to nothing. There's a spring on the underside that holds these two pieces together, and it's awkward. I'm going to get a couple of pairs of tweezers, hold them together with one pair of tweezers, and getting a fine pair of tweezers on the underside here, pick up the tail of that spring, lift it over that hook. That's it assembled. Now get that back in position. and get that gear timed correctly again. That's it. Have another go at getting this spring hooked into place. I'm just going to find another pair of tweezers. I didn't like that pair. Try these ones. There's quite a bit of tension on this spring. That's it, that's sitting in position. Right, that's going quite smoothly so far. As these things go. 2 little brass standoffs. Now watch those because they're easy to displace when you're trying to get this plate in position. I'm just checking this plate. Now that arm is quite stiff. It's rubbing on there. It probably means that plate is distorted in some fashion. Or that this little arm might be distorted. I'm looking to see which one it is. I think the arm's slightly bent down. That's better. That appears to be free. Now I've got to get this in place. There are 3 things here. There's a pin comes through here, a pin comes through here, which you have to get on that side of the spring. This tab has to go into a groove in the case, and this lever has to go forward of that other lever there. And you only have to achieve those 4 things all at the same time. Shouldn't be a problem. Just like that. The plain screw goes at this end. Make sure that brass standoff's lined up correctly. Now I'm just getting back our little green lever which had taken off. It's made a run for it before. I'll just get that back. This is the shoulder screw at this end. And the spring on that, this detent spring here has to be hooked behind that post on that lever so that it is stable in both directions. There's a bit of dust there, I'll just see the back of that. Okay, so that's all looking good. The B lever next. The B lever goes here. And there's a spring which is normally around the head of this screw, but it came adrift before, so I'm not going to fight with that at the moment. Put the screw in place. Check that the lever moves freely, it does. And now I'll fight with the spring and get it seated. There's a groove around the head of the screw there that this spring seats in, just like that. If I'm lucky, I can hook the end of that spring over drag it forward and get it clipped around the arm here. The other end of the spring is on the inside of this lever, so that lever's sprung loaded. Well, that's good, that B lever's in place. I'll check the screw, check the other screws here to make sure I've tightened them up. And the shutter release lever can go on there, and the main lever, but I haven't cleaned those yet, so I'll do that now. I'll get the shutter release lever in place. To get that spring, the spring's an odd shape, but it has to be tucked down on the inside of the case here. It's sometimes a bit tricky to get it seated. It sits at a funny angle. Don't be tempted to improve the look of it. It is supposed to be a funny shape. So I'm wiping some molybdenum paste around the inside and outside of my main lever, and on the bird paw here I'll put some at the head, some at the end of that lever. That looks fine. The shutter itself here and here, and on this lever, that's the pallets there, and down the side here, this lever is the lever on the retard gear train. Now that is under quite a bit of tension. Okay, so that all looks quite good. Let's make sure that this action is in the cocked position. That just pulls one of those levers aside a bit extra and makes it easier to get this spring down the side there. That looks good. Hold back that pallet lever, swing that lever back out of the way, allows this main lever to drop down into position. If I get it spring over its post, check that it moves, it does. There's a spring here on this lever. That lever latches the shutter in the cocked position once it's cocked. That shouldn't be under there, that looks good. Now, it just needs, well, the next thing we need here is the shutter speed settings cam plate, and I'm just getting some molybdenum paste on some useful surfaces, trying not to get it on unuseful surfaces. And one more place I want to hit there, that's where this high speed spring gets compressed. Gives us our 500th of a second speed. It picks up on that corner there, there's a little groove that it picks up. Alright, let's get this plate in place. The B lever, before you push this plate down, make sure the B lever is pulled back out of the way, because otherwise it gets trapped underneath. Like that. Right, that's in place. Now if I cock the shutter, it should work on B. And it does. This should give us a second. This should give us something like a tenth. That's all looking good. If we rolled it round to the 500th of a second speed, you'd see that this spring here starts to get compressed. See, it's picking up there. Now see how it compresses? Now when you cock the shutter, there's my lever. There it is. That spring is acting, giving you a lot more tension on the shutter, and so it fires fast at a faster speed. That's the main difference with the 500th of a second speed, is the position is that spring and not much else besides. Of course the spring is only operating on the push side of the shutter, if you like. It opens the shutter blades. It does nothing about closing the shutter blades. So if you're making a plot of movement against time on the shutter blades while they're open, then they're going to open quite quickly. They're going to close just as slowly as they would have done under any of the other speeds. Right, so I've just put that back in place. Just check that again. I'm just checking these speeds. That's a 10th. That sounds good. The main thing, particularly with the slow speeds, is that there shouldn't be any hesitancy. It should sound smooth. And that's all sounding very good. Well, I can test all those speeds, and then, assuming they're okay, I'll come back, clean the lenses, put them back into the shutter body. I've got to put this in the outer case yet too, don't I? Yeah. Okay, put this in the outer case, clean the lenses, put it all back together, and into camera body. That all seemed fine to me, so I'm just got everything cleaned here to reassemble. I'll apply a wipe of molybdenum paste to that curved rack. Need much, that's plenty. Get the flash connection sorted out first, that's the first thing to do. This is always slightly awkward. Got to get that wire pulled forward into the flash connection hole at the back there. We have our black plastic insulator, and then we have the tiny screw that clamps this shut. Get that screw started. I've got a small screwdriver here that will follow that screw in a bit better. There we go, that's in. If I cock that shutter, that brings the cocking lever round there out around the side. Drop the curved rack into its track. Swing this round to line up the holes. 2 holes there. This screw goes here. You can see the head of that screw's had a hard life. Very short countersunk screw goes at the end here. This third hole over here has nothing in it. There's nothing for that to fit to. And the detent for our, well, the click stops for our apertures. This is not symmetrical. The click stops are close together at the small end, further apart at the big end for your aperture. Okay, that's all looking good. We have the trim ring that goes in at the front and serves not an awful lot more use than that. Our front lens component should screw in. Our rear lens component will screw in. Now I noticed that there's a bit of dust on there. This particular lens has some separation in the rear group. It looks like a tiny star, or a tiny asterisk. Looks shiny like a mirror. That's separation, that's what that looks like. That's where the balsam layer, there's a fault in the balsam layer. Right, so there's the shims. And can fit the shutter back to the camera body. got to time the film advance here to the shutter for cocking this. That didn't cock, so I know I need to advance this at least one tooth, probably more. Okay, so the shutter fires there, cocks and fires there. I'll turn it to a 500th of a second. See if it'll cock and fire there. No, so we need one more tooth. There we go, cocks and fires, that's just all we need. And so the retaining ring can go in place. And then I will check the focus, but I expect that that will be fine. There's one rough spot in that cocking action. I'll have to investigate where it is. The film advance, of course, is under more load now that we're cocking the shutter, so it means that any imperfections in the teeth will tend to show more. There'll be, if there's a tooth that's damaged, that's got effectively got a step on it, that will cause the problem. I'll investigate that and find out what's going on. But apart from that, we have a camera that works, and it's what I'm feeling is a like a bump in the action. It's like there's a distorted tooth there. It's not especially rough, but you can certainly feel something happening. I'll see if I can track it down. Well, that's it, I think. It was certainly a rough camera coming in, but it's in good shape now, works well, everything good, running smoothly. Paint on the back, the warts, they've subsided, not without leaving scars, but it's a lot better than the lumps and bumps it had when it came in. And of course it has the surround on the tripod socket now. And what did it need? I'm just trying to think now all the things it needed to do to this camera. Of course it had no frame counter spring. That was probably major fault number one. Obviously it had that no tripod socket surround on the base of the camera. It had a problem with the warts. They needed to be cured. Mechanically, yeah, there was a bit of chasing around trying to find out faults with that film advance. That certainly kept me entertained. It had certainly done for at least one frame counter spring in its time, and the broken off end of it was in there jamming things up. The shaft was twisted, and that meant that it was reluctant to complete the stroke. Effectively, the top of the shaft is limited in its stroke and its travel by the film advance at the top and by the frame counter spring in particular. That limits the travel of the lever. Underneath there, further down the shaft, you have another component, and if that doesn't come back far enough into the rest position, then it doesn't work either. So when there's a twist, you'll find that you have an inconsistency between the top of the shaft and further down the shaft, and that means that stuff just doesn't end up where it needs to be when it needs to be there. And basically that was the problem. But untwisting that shaft was certainly the thing. The frame counter spring, that certainly needed to be replaced, of course, because there wasn't even one there at all. The mechanism appears to work quite smoothly now. Almost certainly it was too tight, and that's because this piece at the top was dented. And how does that happen? Well, it's a sign that the camera's been dropped on its head at some stage. The struts were in quite good condition. Of course, everything was uniformly filthy. Now it's all nice and clean, and wouldn't look out of place in anyone's collection. Well, at least if you shuffled it to one of the back of the shelf somewhere. It's no museum quality piece, this one, but it's a good working camera. It'd suit most people, I'd imagine, particularly if they wanted a Retina IIa to take photos with. So there you go. That's the Warthog edition Retina IIa.